The small village on the edge of the city always smelled faintly of smoke and fresh soil. Fields stretched far beyond the horizon, and the sound of motorbikes passing on the dusty road was often the loudest thing one could hear. In that quiet place lived two young women, Mai and Lan, childhood friends who had grown up side by side. They were different in temperament. Mai was practical, patient, and usually calm, while Lan was impulsive, curious, and easily excited, but they shared the same stubborn determination to prove that they could do more than what the village expected from them. One late afternoon, while exploring an old shed that belonged to Lan's late uncle, they stumbled upon something unexpected. Hidden under a large canvas cover, covered in dust and spider webs, was a motorcycle. When they pulled the cover off, they gasped. It was a Honda CB750, a machine that in its prime had once been a legend. But now, it was no more than a silent relic. The frame was rusted, the tank's paint had peeled away, the seat had torn apart, and the engine seemed like a lump of forgotten metal. At first, they simply stared at it. Lan was the first to touch it, brushing her hand along the tank, leaving a streak in the dust. "It's still beautiful," she whispered. Mai shook her head, laughing nervously. "It looks more like a pile of scrap. Do you really think we can do anything with this?" Lan's eyes shone with excitement. "Not just anything. We can bring it back." That was the beginning. Neither of them had proper experience with mechanics. Their fathers had taught them basic things, how to change oil, how to patch a tire, how to tighten a loose chain, but restoring a CB750 was on a completely different level. Yet the challenge itself thrilled them. If they succeeded, they would have not only a motorcycle but proved that their determination could conquer doubt. The next day, they pushed the bike out into the yard. Dust flew up, the tires flat and stiff, the chain hanging slack. They borrowed a set of tools from an older mechanic in the village, wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, even a small oil can. With those, they began to work. The first step was disassembly. Every bolt, every nut had to come off. They laid out an old top on the ground and decided to keep each part organized. Lan worked on the seat and body panels while Mai focused on the engine. Their hands soon grew dirty, fingernails blackened, but there was a sense of satisfaction each time the stubborn piece came loose. They laughed at their mistakes, teased each other, and sometimes cursed at bolts that refused to turn. By evening, the motorcycle had become a puzzle of scattered parts. The engine sat heavy and greasy beside the frame. The wheels leaned against the wall. The tank and side covers were stacked carefully. Mai made sketches in a notebook, labeling each part, afraid they might forget where everything went. Lan took pictures with her phone, saying, "We'll thank ourselves later." Days passed. Their work became routine, dismantling, cleaning, inspecting. They scrubbed away layers of rust from the frame with sandpaper, their arms aching from the effort. They sprayed penetrating oil on frozen bolts, sometimes heating them with a small torch borrowed from the blacksmith down the road. Each evening, their clothes smelled of grease and solvent, but their eyes glowed with pride. The villagers noticed, of course. Some old men chuckled when they saw the girls covered in oil, saying, "That's a man's job, not for you." Others shook their heads. "That bike is dead. You're wasting your time." But the girls never argued. They simply smiled and kept working, using the doubt of others as fuel for their persistence. After finishing the frame, they moved on to the tank. The inside was filled with rust flakes. They poured vinegar inside, let it sit overnight, then shook it vigorously with nuts and bolts inside to scrape the walls clean. The next day, they rinsed it and marveled at the difference. It wasn't perfect, but it was usable. For the outside, they sanded the old paint until bare metal appeared, then primed and painted it. They chose a bright red color, bold and passionate, and when it dried, they couldn't stop staring. "It looks alive again," I said softly. Lan grinned. "Just wait until the engine roars." The engine was the greatest challenge. Taking it apart revealed worn pistons, scratched cylinder walls, and gaskets that had disintegrated with age. Replacements were not easy to find, especially in a rural area. They rode bicycles to nearby towns, asking mechanics if they had old CB parts. Sometimes they found treasures, a set of used spark plugs, a gasket kit, even a pair of carburetors that only needed cleaning. Other times, they came back empty-handed, disappointed but not defeated. At night, they studied repair manuals on Mai's phone, reading step by step how to rebuild the four-cylinder engine. The technical terms were overwhelming, but they learned by trial and error. They cleaned pistons, honed cylinders with makeshift tools, checked bearings with improvised gauges. They argued often. Lan wanted to try bold solutions, while Mai insisted on careful precision, but those arguments always ended with laughter and compromise. After weeks of effort, the parts slowly came back together. The frame, now painted black, stood proudly in the yard. The engine, gleaming after endless cleaning, was ready to be mounted. They lifted it together, straining under its weight, until it rested perfectly within the frame. Piece by piece, the puzzle started to resemble a motorcycle once more. It was still far from finished, but the sight filled them with joy. They had reached a milestone that no one thought possible. Neighbors who once mocked them now stopped to watch with curiosity. Children gathered to see the red tank shine in the sun. The two girls smiled, their hearts swelling with pride. For them, it wasn't just about a bike anymore. It was about proving to themselves that they could take on something impossible and make it real. The sun was setting lower each day when the two girls returned from the fields or small errands and immediately threw themselves into their project. The frame stood in the corner of the yard like a skeleton waiting for its soul. The engine was in place, but so many systems still needed attention: electrical wiring, carburetors, exhaust pipes, brakes, wheels, and countless details that could not be ignored. Lan crouched with a flashlight, studying the tangled wires. "These are a mess," she muttered. The insulation was cracked, some ends corroded green. I leaned over her shoulder. We'll have to rewire everything. If we cut corners here, the bike won't even start. They scavenged for wires from old appliances, stripped them carefully, and tested continuity with a cheap multimeter they borrowed. It was slow, meticulous work, but each connection restored felt like a victory. At night, they compared their wiring against diagrams they had found online. Sometimes they disconnected a line and had to redo hours of work, but gradually the chaos turned into order. Meanwhile, they tackled the carburetors. The 4 carb units were gummed up, clogged with varnish from years of sitting. Lan soaked them in kerosene, scrubbing with tiny brushes, while Mike carefully inspected the jets and floats. It was frustrating, because one carb would seem perfect while another leaked, but they refused to give up. If these don't work, the engine won't breathe, I said. So they repeated the cleaning, adjusted the screws, and tested the floats in water until they moved freely. The wheels were another ordeal. The spokes had rusted, the tires were dry and cracked. They spent nearly all of their savings on new tires from a shop in the city. Carrying them home on a borrowed motorbike was an adventure itself, the tires tied with rope and dangling awkwardly. When they finally mounted the new tires on the restored rims, Lan patted them with satisfaction. She'll roll like new, she said. Every day brought fresh challenges. The exhaust pipes were dented, so they hammered them gently back into shape, then polished them until they gleamed. The seat was torn, stuffing spilling out, so they learned to sew new upholstery with fabric they dyed black. For the headlight, they found a cracked shell at a junkyard and patched it with glue and creativity. Slowly, the machine began to look whole again. The frame shone black, the tank glowed red, the seat sat firm, the chrome sparkled in the sun. It was no longer a pile of parts, it was a motorcycle reborn. But the hardest test still lay ahead. Would it start? That evening, after weeks of sweat and persistence, they wheeled the bike into the center of the yard. The neighbors had gathered, curious to see if the impossible would happen. Children perched on the fence, old men crossed their arms skeptically. The air was tense. I checked the fuel line, tightened the last bolt, then nodded to Lan. Ready? Lan swallowed hard, her hands trembling. She turned the key, pressed the choke, and pushed the kickstarter with all her weight. The engine coughed, spat a puff of smoke, then fell silent. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Again, I said firmly. Lan tried once more. The sound was louder this time, closer to life, but still it died. Sweat beaded on her forehead. What if it doesn't work? She whispered. I placed a hand on her shoulder. It will. We built it with our own hands. It has to. They adjusted the choke, tapped the carburetors, and tried again. This time, the engine roared to life with a thunderous growl, deep and raw. The entire yard vibrated with the sound. Smoke rose from the exhaust, but it was the smoke of triumph. The crowd erupted in cheers, children clapping, old men shaking their heads in disbelief. The 2 girls screamed with joy, hugging each other, tears in their eyes. The impossible had happened, the Honda CB750 was alive again. They let it idle, listening to the steady rhythm. The vibrations ran through their bones, filling them with pride. Lan revved the throttle gently, and the engine responded smoothly, like a beast finally freed from its cage. The next step was a test ride. Though nervous, Lan volunteered. She climbed onto the seat, adjusted the mirrors, and steadied her breathing. I held the bike as Lan engaged the clutch and shifted into first gear. With a cautious twist of the throttle, the motorcycle rolled forward, wobbling at first, then gliding across the dirt road. Cheers followed her as she accelerated, the sound of the 4-cylinder engine echoing across the fields. Her hair flew in the wind, her heart raced, and for a moment, she felt limitless. She circled back, laughing uncontrollably, and I ran to meet her. Mai's tone was calmer, but her smile was just as wide. Riding the machine they had rebuilt together felt like holding a piece of freedom in their hands. The bike wasn't perfect, some rattles still echoed, and brakes needed fine-tuning, but it was theirs, crafted by their persistence. From then on, the CB750 wasn't just transportation. It became a symbol of their bond, their courage, and their refusal to accept limits. Villagers who once doubted now admired them. Some even asked for help with their own broken bikes, and the girls discovered that they enjoyed the work, not only for themselves but for the respect it earned. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset reflect off the red tank, talking about dreams of riding far beyond the village, exploring new places, maybe even opening a small repair shop. The Honda CB750, once abandoned and forgotten, had been given a second life by 2 determined young women. And in breathing life back into the machine, they had also discovered their own strength. The road ahead was open, and they were ready to ride it together.